Hey everybody, it's Dr. Osborne. Welcome back to the Pick Dr. Osborne's Brain Show. We're excited tonight. Another great Monday night. We're going to be talking all about a category that oftentimes gets missed, and that's foods that cause GI distress or tummy issues, however you want to put it. And this category we're going to dive into in a little bit of detail tonight. Now we've touched on parts and bits of it in the past, but we're really going to try to dive in a little bit more in detail. Before we get started, make sure you let me know where you're from. So chime in, let me know where you're coming from in the world, where you're tuning in from, and also if you've got questions, go ahead and start typing those in now. I'm going to do my best, as always, to get as many answered. And those of you who are maybe new to the Dr. Osborne Show, understand what our mission is. We're out to help 100 million chronically sick people find real answers to health problems where they have not been able to get help in the past. In essence, where maybe medicine has failed them, where they've really struggled. Our goal is to help bring light and hope to these people, so we can't do that without you. Make sure you're sharing this. Make sure you're copying that URL up above and sharing this video with them, or sharing the replay with them if you think that this information might be helpful. Additionally, make sure you go over to glutenfreesociety.org, our foundational website, and if you didn't already, sign up there to get our free newsletter, and we'll send you a free gluten-free survival guide in the process of doing that. That also gets you notifications for every time that we do go live, and that way you don't ever miss a show, or you always can put it on your calendar and know when to tune in. So again, let me know where you're from, number one, and number two, if you've got questions, go ahead and start putting those in right now. And I'm going to just start pulling up my feed here. Give me just a minute. It looks like already tuning in, we've got Dana from Dallas. I didn't know there was a Dallas, Oregon. I'm from Texas, so we've got Muriel from Amsterdam. I visited Amsterdam last October, had a good time there. Ronnie tuning in, and Ilka tuning in as well. Sandy from Grapevine, Texas, right up near Dallas. Okay, let's see here. All right. Here we go. We got a little slow on our internet tonight. Super slow on our internet tonight. That's okay. We can look at that all day, and that's not going to do us any good. So, good deal. So let's talk about it. Foods that cause GI diseases, or just GI distress, or GI disturbances, however you want to put it. So there are a number of different ones. Now again, if you've been watching me for any length of time, you're going to know that gluten is at the top of that list. Gluten as a protein found in wheat, barley, rye, and other grains can contribute to damage to the GI tract, particularly the small intestine, directly causing villous atrophy. But many of you watching me already are going gluten-free. You've already done the gluten-free diet to a great degree. You're already complying with that. So we want to dive in a little bit more to some of the other things that beyond gluten that can still continue to cause GI distress. And so one of those categories of foods, it's a category, you might have heard of this before, it's called FODMAPs, F-O-D-M-A-P-S. FODMAPs, also known as fermentable oligomono and polysaccharides, are basically items that can be found in food, and sweeteners and sugar-like substances that are found in food that can be very difficult to digest. They tend to cause a lot of gastric distress, particularly gas and bloating. Perfect example of a food high in FODMAP, or high in fructose in this case, would be something like honey. Many people try to use honey as a natural sweetener to do their grain-free baking and find they don't do very well with it at all. So honey can be one of those things you want to be paying close attention to. If it gives you a lot of gas and bloating, you may have a problem with FODMAPs. Now there are other FODMAPs beyond honey. One of the other common things used in baking and grain-free baking are your alcohol sugars, the things like xylitol or tagatose. If you've used products on the market like XylaSweet, or TheraSweet and you didn't do well and they caused you a lot of gas and intestinal discomfort, could very well be the reason why is you're not tolerating FODMAPs very well. Another kind of class within the FODMAPs, garlic and onion, which are commonly used in a number of different recipes to add seasoning and flavoring to the food. And so especially if you're cooking any ethnic types of food at all, onion and garlic can be used quite heavily, and a lot of people struggle a lot with those. We actually have, I'll put it into the feed here for you, we have a link. It's Stanford Medical has a really nice list of the FODMAP foods, and so beyond the sake of going into every single one, I'm going to post that link in the feed for you. So if you think that FODMAPs may be something that you're struggling with or you want to investigate a little bit more closely, FODMAPs, feel free to do that. Now, if you suspect FODMAPs, one of the things that I want you to understand is it doesn't mean you have to eliminate them all. As you're looking at a list of all the FODMAP containing foods, it can be overwhelming and somewhat daunting, and a lot of people get paralyzed with fear and they just can't move forward anymore. Don't start with the whole list of FODMAPs. Kind of look at them by groupings and start, maybe remove one group at a time and see how well you do. So you don't necessarily need to remove that entire list all at the same time. Again, a lot of people freak out when they see that list because it's a lot of the common things that you add to your food, or it's a lot of the common things that you cook your food with. Okay, let's see here. We got Maxine tuning in from Pennsylvania. Good evening, Maxine. And Matthew Gibbs tuning in from Cyprus. Good to hear you. Good to see you. We got Corinne from Greencastle, and that's Pennsylvania. Let's see. Marie from Toronto, Canada. And, okay, so Teresa from Canada. Gabazova from Canada, from Toronto. So a lot of Canadians tuning in tonight. Welcome. Marianne from Colorado. Again, let me know where you're from. Those of you who are just tuning in, love to see how far we're reaching in the world. So chime in and let us know. Let us know where you're coming from. Okay, so we're talking about FODMAPs. Again, we're posting that link up into the feed for you because we could do an entire show on FODMAPs alone, but I want to kind of make sure that we're getting a broad sweep of all of these because a lot of people end up missing key elements when they just go on a gluten-free diet. Now, if you have not heard of this term before, I'm going to back up for just a minute. If you haven't heard this term, true gluten-free, that could be one of the other issues that you're struggling with, is that you're still eating what are considered to be the classic gluten-free grains. You need to look up True Gluten-Free Diet. You can go to glutenfreesociety.org and read more about this. You can also go to Barnes & Noble or pick up No Grain, No Pain from Amazon.com or any other major book retailer. That's No Grain, No Pain, where we talk about the True Gluten-Free Diet, because a lot of you are consuming, you're still consuming glutens. You just don't realize that those things are glutens. And that, examples include things like corn and rice and sorghum and millet. So again, if you're using a lot of those products, those gluten-free products from the grocery store shelves made by those different types of grains, know that you could be creating a much bigger problem for yourself. Another family of foods that's somewhat notorious for creating or can create an issue in the GI tract is the nightshades. And now, again, I'm going to speak from my own experience within the clinic, and that is the big one that I see creating most of the problem for a lot of people is potato, not so much some of the other ones. Now, I'm talking about tummy problems or gut problems. Now, I see a lot of people with nightshades, things like eggplant and tomato and peppers, have horrendous joint pain as a result of nightshade consumption if they are nightshade sensitive. And that's not what I'm referring to here. I'm referring to the potato, and whether it's a white potato or a red potato or a russet potato or a golden potato or a potato with brown skin and white innards. And I'm not talking about sweet potatoes here, but I'm talking about the potato plant itself, the root vegetable. This is where we'll see a lot of problems. There have been some studies that have shown that white potatoes actually cause leaky gut. And I don't know if we have that image on cue here, but if Alan can pull that for us, if we've got it in a file, I'll pop that up on the screen right now and show you. There are a number of different causes for leaky gut. One of them has actually been shown to be potato, and it's because there's a compound in potato that can actually irritate the GI tract and irritate the gut lining, leading to that damage. So very important. Again, if you're eating a lot of potato, maybe you're already grain-free, maybe you've already investigated FODMAPs, but you're eating potato on a frequent basis. A lot of people cook with potato flour, or they're using potato starch to thicken their gravy, or they're using just eating the regular potatoes. This is something you definitely want to consider. Now, another group here is dairy, and I did an entire show on dairy. I'm not going to belabor. 90% of the points are very well explained in that past episode. We can probably throw that link up in the feed as well for those of you who haven't seen it or want to know more about dairy. But what I want to focus on with the dairy creating GI distress has more to do with this, lactose intolerance, than it has to do with dairy allergy or dairy mimicking gluten, or the processing of dairy making the dairy protein resemble gluten, or the fact that that dairy in and of itself, for many people, the way the dairy is the way the dairy cows themselves are fed, and some of the problems that go into the hormones with dairy. We're talking about the lactose intolerance. Understand that lactose is a sugar that is found in dairy products, and many people don't have the enzyme, the lactase. They don't produce adequate quantities of lactase in their GI tract to be able to break down lactose, and so this is where it creates an intolerance type of response, or an indigestion, gas, bloating, burping or belching. These are all potential symptoms of, again, of lactose intolerance. Now, many people will go with, you know, the different dairy-based products that have the enzyme, the lactase in it, in essence, the enzyme that helps you break them down, and they feel better. They don't get quite the GI distress when they use those products. I don't recommend them because they're highly processed, and you're not going to get healthy. You're not going to seek and find health in the bottom of a highly processed container of food that's been manipulated to such a great degree to allow you to be able to tolerate something that your body doesn't want you to tolerate. So I don't recommend them. Use with caution. But again, dairy and lactose intolerance, one of the most overlooked. I've heard people say, you know, come into the office, you know what, I just can't give up my ice cream. I don't want to give it up. And you always have that choice, right? This is not me telling you what to do. This is me trying to give you information so you can make more intelligent decisions about how to get healthy. So, you know, choose as a good discretion is my advice. Okay, let's see here. Oh, I like this question because it actually is, it's one of the things that I was getting ready to add to the list, and that's quinoa. And so one of the questions coming in is, how long does it take to heal after you've removed quinoa out of your diet? It depends if your diet contains other things, but generally speaking, several months. You've got to get it out of your diet for several months. But quinoa can be another one. Now, quinoa is oftentimes used as a pasta substitute. A lot of people will buy the quote-unquote gluten-free quinoa products, whether it's a pasta or foods like where the salad and the quinoa is used as a base, or some people are actually making noodles and other things with quinoa. But a recent study, it's about 6 years ago, showed that quinoa actually, a couple of the proteins in quinoa mimic gluten enough to create gastrointestinal damage. So you've got to be real careful with this. Not everybody can do quinoa, and if you're just going in this direction, my advice is to get it out at the very minimum for at least the first 6 months, and you might have to keep it out, you know, indefinitely, because as my experience shows, many people that have gluten sensitivity gene patterns still react to quinoa, and the research supports what I actually see within the clinic itself. So again, quinoa is another one of those that you have to be highly aware of and cautious about. And it's technically gluten-free. There is no gluten in quinoa. It's a pseudo grain or a pseudo cereal, so there's technically no gluten in it. But again, it can look enough like gluten, the proteins in quinoa, to mimic it to create a response or a reaction. Okay, let's see here. Peru's from Los Angeles. Hi, Misty. Welcome, Misty, from the Scleroderma group. Let's see here. Okay, lots more of you chiming in from all over the world. We got a few of you coming in from Australia. I want to talk about another category here, and these are going to fall more under the category not of foods but of food additives, and those are the gums. And I've got an entire entire article on gums, on the different kinds of gums, the ones that you need to be aware of. But the big one that we see is carrageenan. And carrageenan gum, and if I spell this incorrectly, it's because I can never remember if it's got 2 R's or 1 R, so forgive me for that. But carrageenan gum is one that, in studies, it shows that it can create gastrointestinal inflammation. And so a lot of people don't do well with it. So you might find that your coconut milk or your almond milk or your nut milks, if you're using nut milk substitutes, can be problematic because of the carrageenan, and they may not sit right, and they may lead to gastrointestinal inflammation. So that's another one that you want to make sure that you're looking out for, because it's a very, very common food additive. I actually see it in toothpaste as well. They use it as a thickening agent, although less problematic in toothpaste because you're not eating your toothpaste, you're not drinking it down. Although if you are super sensitive to it, even swallowing enough residual can, for some people, create a problem. So again, check your ingredients, check your label, and make sure that you're aware that carrageenan is one of those that can create a problem. Okay, let's see here. So we got okay, pulling up my feed here. Okay, so let's dive into a few questions here. Melanie is asking, could my long-term diarrhea cause vitamin deficiency? Yeah, absolutely. So long-term diarrhea, if you've got consistent diarrhea, one of the things that's happening is your gut is flushing you out consistently enough. And if it's bad enough, if it's happening especially right after you eat, and that's the trigger, then you may not be absorbing the nutrients from your food. And so very much malnutrition is one of the side effects of chronic diarrhea. We see this very frequently in inflammatory bowel diseases like ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, even in cases of celiac disease, where the gut is so inflamed that the food is just being pushed out in diarrhea fashion. And that, again, not only will it cause dehydration and electrolyte loss, but it can cause mineral deficiency. It can cause fat malabsorption, like vitamin A, vitamin D, E, and K. Those are fats. Omega-3 fats can become deficient when you have, chronic diarrhea. So absolutely. So the key there is to determine where the chronic diarrhea is coming from. And that, I highly advise you work with a good functional medicine doctor to get that part figured out. Those of you who don't know what functional medicine is, you can visit drpeterosborne.com, and there's an entire page there that discusses what functional medicine actually is. And again, highly recommend that if you're struggling to find an answer and you feel like you're on your own, you're not really getting any resolution from what you're doing, that you work with a qualified functional medicine doc to get you moving in the right direction. Okay. Another one, 10 years into celiac diagnosis, this is from Mark, I was wondering how many older patients gotten accustomed to GI distress that they thought it was normal, something you run across often. Now, I love this question because a lot of times if you grew up with something and you thought it was normal and you adapt that norm into your life as it's not abnormal, then you don't really ever know that it's not normal until either one, it goes away, or two, somebody sheds light on it and helps you understand that that's not normal. I've actually had people come to see me that they were having 6, 7, 8 bowel movements a day, loose bowel movements, basically diarrhea, and thought it was normal. I've had other people not go to the bathroom for 7 days at a time and think that was normal because that's the way it's always been for them. And so, again, it's kind of one of those topics people don't want to talk about, right? Poop. And how often do you poop? But it's a very critical process. It's one of the ways that, our digestive tract, it's a quarantine zone from the mouth to the anus. One of its jobs is to help separate the food, the good nutrients, from the bad, from the waste. And so we should be having a bowel movement 1 to 2 times a day very easily. And a lot of people don't talk about it because it's embarrassing, the whole topic itself. So a lot of kids, as they're growing up, they don't know what normal is, and their parents aren't following them to the bathroom. And so what ends up happening is they grow up thinking that this norm of having diarrhea all the time, or this norm of only having 1 bowel movement a week, is an actual norm instead of an abnorm. And so yes, the answer to that question is a lot of people have a false perception of what's actually normal. So on that front, everyone listening today should understand that it's very normal to have 1 to 2 solid bowel movements a day. And if you're not doing that, then you may have a problem. And that problem might be some of these things that we're actually talking about today. There's another category I want to go in and dive into, because this has come up a lot in email questions lately: beans or legumes. And so it's one of those areas where the question keeps coming up because people are very confused on it. Technically, beans and legumes are gluten-free. However, understand, many people, when they're going gluten-free to improve their health, they're not playing with a functioning GI tract. Their guts are somewhat broken. They're not working to the full capacity. And so if you trade out grain, for example, instead of wheat bread, you're buying the bean flour, or instead of the wheat noodles, you're buying the bean noodles, understand that legumes and beans contain lectins and other compounds that are very, very hard to digest. They can be very, very difficult for an unhealthy digestive tract to process. So if you're just trading one out for the other in mass quantity, this is one of the biggest mistakes I see people make, where they end up in GI distress, is they're over-consuming the beans, the legumes, the bean flours, the bean products. And part of the reason they're doing that is because they're looking for substitutes for the true gluten-free diet. They're looking for something to switch out. They're looking for a trade-off. And what I want you to understand is that if your gut is in a chronic state of disarray and it's been damaged for years because of your food choices, because maybe you're gluten sensitive and you've been eating gluten, you can't put food in that's hard to digest or hard to process if your gut's broken. You will struggle ever recovering or ever getting better. So it's very important that you understand that you don't want to use those substitute bean and legume pastas. Again, my advice is to definitely get this out for 6 months. You can bring it back in slowly. And if you're going to bring it back in, the way that I recommend that you do it is don't buy all the processed junk food, boxed garbage, because that stuff isn't going to be good for you regardless, right? What you're looking for is whole, fresh, where you're soaking. And for most beans, soaking and draining is the proper way to prepare them. Most cultures, if you look at many cultures that actually eat beans, what do? They sprout them or ferment them. They basically either let nature run its course so that the sprout comes out, and a lot of the compounds within beans that are hard to digest are basically washed away, or they ferment them using bacteria to break the bean down or to pre-digest the bean before they try to eat it. I mean, tofu or miso is a perfect example of that. Sprouted beans, if you ever, in science class, if you ever did the project where you had the cup and the pinto bean and you put it in the dirt and you watched the bean over a few days, it started to sprout. Well, with beans, you can soak and drain them. My advice is soak for 12 hours and then drain them, and do that at least twice before you cook them. And then cook them very long, and cook them, like if you're using like a high pressure cooker like an Instapot or a pressurized cooker, that is going to break down, the heat will break down the bonds in the beans and make it a lot easier on your digestive tract. It's almost better to eat it if it's in a sense and almost like a curd where it's been broken down really, really well. So again, you're not giving all of that work for your broken gut to try to handle. This is hands down one of the biggest mistakes I see, because beans are grain-free, and again, a lot of people are going to gravitate toward them. If you're familiar at all with the paleo diet, this is, the work of Dr. Lauren Cordain. This is one of the reasons why beans are out in the paleo diet. It's because they're very hard to digest, and generally speaking, if you're following the hunter-gatherer theory of human evolution around food, humans didn't go around eating very hard to digest beans because again, a lot of gastric distress. So this was not a staple food of a hunter-gatherer diet per se. It became more of a staple food along the lines of agriculture, when agriculture became more and more popular as a way to acquire food. Okay, let's see here. So Sandy's chiming in. She's saying she's removed as much from her diet as possible without testing, and it's given her great relief and great improvement, but she's still struggling. my advice to you, Sandy, and I don't know if you've done this, but follow the 30-day protocol in No Grain, No Pain. In essence, really skip to phase 2. There's phase 1, which is the first 15 days, which is chapter 7, and then there's phase 2, which is chapter 8. Just skip right to chapter 8 and dive into chapter 8. And if that's not doing the trick for you in 30 days, I really highly recommend you start budgeting for some of the types of testing that can give you a little bit more accuracy in terms of which foods you might be consuming. Because a lot of people where this problem doesn't go away and they've done everything right in the diet that they know to try to do, it's one of two things. Either it's a hidden food that they're reacting to, they're having an inflammatory response, so we'll call that a delayed allergy. Okay, and you have to test for these. You can't guess them. It's impossible to guess because the window of reaction for a delayed allergy is 3 hours to 3 weeks. So if you're trying to guess that, you'll never hit the mark in an accurate way. The other thing though is stress, and this is a big problem around food, because a lot of people start cutting out food, and they cut out food as if food is an enemy. And then they develop what I would like to call a food phobia, where the whole act of eating, the whole psychological premise around eating becomes this big phobia. And so every time it's time for a meal or it's time to think about food, their body goes into fight or flight. And when your body goes into fight or flight, the blood supply to your gut is minimized, and it's sent to your periphery and to your brain so that you can run or fight and not digest, right? So if you've developed this kind of a psychological food phobia around all foods, you kind of want to go back to understanding that all food is not necessarily the fundamental only reason why a person can become ill. And there are a lot of other factors involved in this. So again, why I wrote No Grain, No Pain, and spent a lot of time in the earlier chapters talking about some of the lifestyle parameters that you really need to make sure that you're living by, because a lot of people have unresolved stress, unresolved trauma, bad relationships, poor sleep habits, poor exercise habits, lack of sunshine, and they're trying to remove foods from their diet, but they're not doing the fundamental things that have to be done on a consistent day in and day out basis to actually achieve a level of health. So you've got to keep those things in mind as well. We don't just want to blame food. We have to have good choices and good behavior around making good choices about our food. So delayed allergies and stress are two of the big ones. And I would say if you're still struggling with, you can look that up and maybe dial in a little bit more tightly. I like this comment because it's really quite true, and that's apple cider vinegar, a teaspoon or a tablespoon in this case, with several ounces of water 10 minutes before your meal can really help digestion. And this is less to do with foods that cause GI distress and more to do with not having adequate stomach acid, because apple cider vinegar can act as a source of acid in the stomach and aid in digestion. Now that being said, sometimes what happens is people eat foods that cause GI distress, and the outcome of that is then they take medications to block stomach acid because their perception is that they have acid reflux. And so then they get put on a drug like Nexium or Prilosec or Tagamet or Zantac, etc. And then they start blocking their own stomach acid. And then what happens here is that then all foods start to cause GI distress because they're not digesting it. And then they'll add something in like an apple cider vinegar, which gives them a little bit more acid in terms of their stomach and their capacity to digest foods. And they do digest better. They do feel better. And if you've got that as part of your history, you really got to address this piece up here before, because nothing down here, removing it might be helpful, but as long as that's being suppressed, it's going to create a problem in that way. This is some great feedback you guys are giving tonight. So this is a question from Christopher. What tests should I run to see vitamin mineral deficiencies, food allergies, like Shannon and Jessica? There are several different tests. There's not one test, because there's 7 different ways that you can have a reaction to food. There are multiple different ways that you can have that you can test for vitamin and mineral deficiencies. One of the tests that I can give you a couple of different things here. One of the tests that I really like for vitamin and mineral deficiencies is called a SpectraCell, and that test can be done and it measures more than 30 different nutrients. It doesn't have all the nutrients that I test for. There are some other specific tests that I have to add to this in order to get a comprehensive picture of the 40 different essential nutrients that we really like to measure when when we're trying to evaluate a person's nutritional status. But this is a really good place to start because you do get a lot from one panel. So hopefully that'll help you out. You can call your doc, and a lot of times your doc, you'll say, do you do this? And they'll say no. And I'm going to give you all some advice, because if you know the name of this test and you go to your doctor and your doctor doesn't really order that test, you don't want to go to that doctor to have that test run, because part of this test is interpretation. Even though you can get it and you can look at the result and the lab is going to give you a generic interpretation, if you're doing this and you're trying to troubleshoot your health, you want to work with an expert or a professional. And if that doctor is just ordering it for you as a favor, now you've got this lab that you're left to interpret. And I've seen people a number of times bring these things into me. It was completely misinterpreted. They were on a horrible supplemental regimen. It didn't do them any good, and they lost their money. They lost the value of the test. This test is really great because it gives you a 6-month window to start supplementing or changing your diet in. But if you've got bad advice or you've got no guidance, it may not be enough. A lot of the generic lab recommendations that are provided by the lab, the doses are equivalent to spitting out a forest fire. They're just not high enough to correct certain deficiencies. Remember, the lab has to proceed with caution because they don't have a relationship with that person in a one-on-one basis. And so again, a lot of times, to really get good correction of a nutrient deficiency, you've got to go much, much higher doses. And so working with somebody who's an expert, who's got experience, makes all the difference in the world when you're getting labs like this done, because a lot of people will go generally just get the labs done, and then they'll try to do it themselves at home. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't try something. I'm just saying if you're going to start spending money on lab, you need to start spending money on qualified person who can help guide you through that. Otherwise, you end up with a mess, and you've wasted a bunch of time and a bunch of money and not gotten anywhere. And then your perception of nutrition and nutritional testing is that it doesn't work. And it's not that it doesn't work, it's that you've got to have the right guidance when you're doing something like this. So again, I can't emphasize that enough. I just see too many people throwing money away and not getting the right advice, or going to another doctor who's not qualified to order nutritional testing because they don't even understand nutrition, but they're going to that doctor and taking that doctor's advice. Again, you've got to find the right type of functional medicine practitioner, in my opinion, if you really want to have a good degree of success in this front. Let's see here. All right, so question coming in on other lab tests. There's a test called a Nutria Val. I don't use it. Basically it's a urine/blood test. It's not super accurate. The test result can change from day to day. One of the problems when you're measuring nutritional status is you need to have some type of set point marker where when you draw the blood or you take the specimen, that it gives you an average over time. It doesn't give you a moment in time. The example or the analogy is like this. If you go to the movie and I only let you watch the first 30 seconds and then tell you to leave, and then I say, I want you to tell me all about that movie, but you only have 30 seconds access to the 2-hour movie, that's kind of like getting blood work for nutritional testing. When you get that vitamin B12 level measured in your serum, you don't know if it's high or if it's low because of your diet this morning or your diet today. You don't know what was influencing it around that time. Sometimes the liver redistributes nutrients and you can get false elevations or you can get false lows. So understanding that part of it is when you're running tests, you've got to make sure your doctor understands this really well, because they've got to be able to pick and choose the right battery of tests. Otherwise, you're getting misled. You're getting false information. And it's so extremely common for people to get false information from this. More questions about. Look, I don't like talking about other tests. The wheat zoomer, as a test overall, is the most progressive way to look at some of the different proteins that people can react to as it relates to gluten. But it's still not comprehensive. I mean, we're talking about 1,000 different proteins There is no lab that measures that. The only accurate way to really truly assess gluten sensitivity, if you want to get super accurate, is genetic testing. You've got to do genetic testing. I'll put a link up here in the feed for you on genetic testing. But if you're not doing genetic testing, the propensity to get false negative is extremely high. I see it all the time. I even see it when people bring in their wheat germs, or they'll bring in their other labs from other lab companies where they're measuring things like anti-gliadin antibodies or anti-tissue transglutaminase or some of the celiac panels, and they come back and they've been told eat all the gluten they want, yet when we run their genetic testing, we get an accurate result. We take them true gluten-free, and then they start responding and they start healing. So again, part of it is the test and the technology that's being used. Part of it is the expertise of the doctor, and when it comes to functional medicine, you really want to work with somebody who understands nutrition, because that, way it boils down, is functional medicine is largely based, as it relates to diet anyway, what you put in your mouth, on nutritional biochemistry. And if you're working with somebody who doesn't have a thorough understanding of that, you're gonna run into problems, and you're gonna continue to struggle. That's just what I see repetitively. Now, some of you may have worked on your own and did really well, and you're feeling really great just with the diet change alone. And to those of you who've had that experience and that success, that's great. That's fantastic. I'm not trying to pick on anybody. I'm just simply saying, if you're struggling and you're not finding answers when you're trying to do it on your own, you really want to work with somebody who can help you. Yeah, I hear you, Bridget. One doctor in Australia, and the waiting time is 8 to 9 months. Yeah, I know, it's a problem, and we're trying to solve that problem. This is part of our mission, is to help 100 million people. I train doctors every year. I take in a group of doctors and train them every year. It is a big part of the problem, is the training. It's a lot of doctors are not getting the training that they need to be able to do these types of things. Here's one, Nancy. The doctors in Canada just tell you to check, don't tell you to check your diet, but just give you pills. Yeah, that's not unlike the doctors in America or the doctors in Europe. They all pretty much espouse the same type of, I'll call it rhetoric, because it certainly isn't healthcare, to give somebody a chemical to artificially manipulate their biochemistry to mask their symptoms so that you can appease them under the guise of compassion. You can appease their symptoms, ease their pain, so to speak, by allowing their pain to continue, because you don't really solve the problem. I mean, that to me is the biggest travesty there. Okay, so going back to the topic at hand, we've got gluten, and I made a mention about the difference between gluten and true gluten-free, and then FODMAPs as a category, nightshades, particularly potato, can create leaky gut for many people. Dairy, the lactose, and for many that are lactose intolerant, can create a lot of the gas and the bloating. The quinoa can create gastrointestinal inflammation. The carrageenan gum is another one that can create gastrointestinal inflammation. And then the category of beans or legumes as a whole, for many people, creates a lot of distress because they're very, very hard to digest. Now, one more category I wanted to make sure I brought up tonight, because this again comes in all the time, and that's the category of seeds. Seeds are, predominantly seeds. Grains in and of themselves are seeds. So if we think about what grain is, grain and gluten, those are the seeds of grass, right? So generally seeds like chia and flax and sunflower seed, and a lot of people will take ground seed meal and other things, and they'll use that as a staple in their diet. And that, again, it's another one of those things that can be really hard to digest. Seeds contain sensory proteins. Sensory proteins are basically proteins within seeds that are designed to protect the seeds from predators eating them into extinction. So if you are consuming vast quantities of seeds and still struggling with gastric distress, and I've seen this, most commonly I see it when people are doing like smoothies and they're adding tons of chia or they're adding tons of flax, and they're still struggling with that gastric distress. Now, I'm not saying that you can never eat seeds like chia or flax, and I'm not saying that you could never eat beans, but this is, a lot of times it's a case-by-case basis. If you're overcoming years of intestinal damage as a result of gluten exposure, these are things that too many people keep in their diet initially en masse. They keep them in their diet in large quantities, and doing so kind of basically it sabotages their success. It sabotages their ability to recover because they're still eating things that are hard to digest. And going back to what I said earlier, if you're eating food that's hard to digest and your gut's already not working with full capacity, that will delay your progress, that will delay your healing, and that will contribute to a number of different problems. So again, you have to look at it from that perspective. So the beans, the seeds, the FODMAPs, nightshades, dairy, the quinoa, the gums, very, very common. Now, I mentioned medicine up here earlier, and this is another big issue. Even though medicine's not classified as a food, many people are on medicine because they choose the wrong food. And so when you're choosing the wrong food and you've been put on a medication, and one of the things that I've seen really quite common is high blood pressure meds. People that are gluten sensitive can develop high blood pressure. I see it all the time. And then they get put on high blood pressure med. And one of the blood pressure meds called olmesartan actually has been shown to cause celiac disease. It's been shown to cause villus atrophy. And so a lot of people don't realize that. And many of you may not even have a known gluten issue, but your doctor put you on this particular drug to lower your blood pressure, and it can actually create villus atrophy. And this actually was, I think, originally discovered at Mayo Clinic. There was a study published a number of years ago, 7 or 8 years ago, easy. And so you want to understand that many of the medications that we take, and I did an entire show on this as well, where we talked about the different medications that can cause gut dysfunction and leaky gut. You've got to address the foods, then you've got to look at the medicines and work with your doctor to wean them down, to titrate them down so that you can really fully stabilize the gut. Once that happens, and you're feeling better and vibrant and energetic, and your diet and your lifestyle is really dialed in, now you can start taking a look at some of these groupings and say, okay, am I still reactive to these things because I'm always going to be, or am I reacting, or am I not reactive to them anymore because I've restored my resiliency and my health and my GI capacity for breaking food down? And so again, that's the basis of what I wanted to get out tonight. We're going to dive back into some additional questions. Okay. Okay, so Lisa's asking, do genetics or ethnicity determine what food issues we develop? Yeah, genetics can, but less so than what most people realize. I mean, the genetic correlation, the biggest genetic correlation I've seen is with gluten sensitivity. You either have the genes for gluten sensitivity reaction or you don't. And if you do, and you eat gluten, then you activate those genes to produce inflammation, and then it's that inflammation that slowly poisons you over time, destroying your tissues slowly over time. But don't be quick to blame your genetics. Now, there may be some of you with very, very unique cultural or genetic backgrounds. For I don't know if the audience, if there's anyone out there, and let me know if there's anybody out there who's an Inuit Eskimo or a Pima Indian, for an example. Those folks have, really, really high propensity toward high meat diets and high fat diets. Genetically, that's the way they've evolved for thousands and thousands of years. But a lot of you that are out there listening and watching may not have that same, gene pattern. So genetics typically doesn't play as much of a role as we give it credit for, although it can play a role. Let's see here. What about nuts after soaking? So that's a good one because we didn't really bring up nuts. And typically, for a lot of people, tree nuts are okay. Now there are going to be rare exceptions to that in my experience, and I know there's a whole protocol called AIP, autoimmune paleo, where a lot of people are avoiding all the nuts. And for some people that is necessary. In my experience, for most it is not. So tree nuts, not quite the same genetically as a seed or a legume. They're not quite as hard to digest, and so typically are a lot better tolerated. Now some people do better when they soak them. I would simply say the one nut that's oftentimes referred to as a nut that's not really a nut, there's actually two. One is the peanut, which is a legume, and so it falls in this category. And the other one is the cashew, which isn't a nut, it's a seed, so it falls into this category. And both of those can contain, well, peanuts can contain a lot of lectins and mycotoxins that can create gastric distress. And then cashew has it grows on the bottom of a kind of a golden bell-shaped fruit, and it secretes kind of an oil over it that's an irritant. It's a gastric irritant, so that for many people creates a problem. And speaking of gastric irritants, And I didn't put it on here, but one of the other problems, a big one that I think is worth mentioning, is caffeine. A lot of people overconsume caffeine. They're drinking too much coffee, too much tea, and the caffeine in and of itself can be a gastric irritant. So if your gut, again, if it's already damaged and you're overconsuming this, this can be another one of those things that has a damaging effect on the GI tract, and you should be aware of that. Is there a difference between a doctor who practices integrative medicine and functional medicine? A huge difference. Let's say it like this. Integrative medicine means it's almost like it's a blend. It's integrating some nutrition and some natural medicine with medicine. So an integrative doctor is more kind of blending medicine with nutrition, whereas a functional medicine doctor tends to try to avoid medicine altogether. I mean, the philosophy and the premise of functional medicine is we only use medicine in acute situations where life is imminently in danger and we want to save a person's life. Whereas you know, we don't have a belief pattern that using medicine on a daily basis to suppress symptoms plays a role in health recovery. We believe it actually gives you crutches, you know, proverbial crutches to walk on, and again, giving you false sense of security, and that doesn't serve you in the long run. What serves you are hard truths. A lot of people don't like to hear truth these days. We live in a very politically correct type of world, and people, you know, they're scared to speak the truth and they're scared to hear the truth. But the reality is, you know, well, we could say very honestly, 90+% of all illness that's chronic and degenerative is diet and lifestyle choice based, period. No medicine will ever fix that, so it doesn't make sense to try to use medicine to mitigate that or manage it. It makes better sense to proverbially slap the person in the face with truth so that they at least are awoken to the thought process that the change needs to come from within them. They have the strength to heal themselves. They have the power to heal themselves, but they have to look at those hard truths first to take action on them. Let's see here. This question coming in, Travis says that my friend's son had allergy testing done today. They poked his back and told him he was basically allergic to tons of things. Have him a Claritin D prescription and said, come back in a month. What would you have done? If it were my kid, Travis, I would have walked out. Actually, well, it's not fair because I know what I know. But, you know, what I would have done is I would have taken my son to a different type of doctor who would have run non-skin prick testing. Realize when they do the skin prick test, what are they doing? If you know, they're using corn-based alcohol swab to wipe the back down before they puncture the back with different needle agents that are lined with antigens. And so if you're allergic or reactive to corn alcohol, then you're going to react to everything on that test. It's just, in my opinion, there's a lot of flaw in that type of testing. I prefer an IgE. If they're measuring, because that's what they're measuring in a skin prick, is they're measuring something called an IgE response. You can measure IgE response in the blood, and in my opinion, it's a lot more accurate. And so that's one element that I would recommend would be IgE blood testing. And more specifically, not for environmental stuff, not for the oak and the hay and the pollen, but for food. You can't control the weather, so it doesn't really serve you to know that you're going to react to this, that, and the other as much as it serves you to know that you should not eat certain foods. Because think about it like this, Travis, when your body's immune system is so busy fighting food that it doesn't have the resources to fight the environment, you become hyperallergic. And this is what happens to a lot of these kids. They're hyperallergic and they need to live in their, you know, their bubble, mainly because all of the food that they're eating is stimulating their immune system and taking the resources away from being able to properly respond to the environment, so they become hyperallergenic. So discern what those foods are first. The foods are more critical because you have 100% control over the diet change. And if you implement that diet change, and you'll see that a lot of people, when they implement diet change, become a lot less allergic to their outdoor allergens. In essence, a lot of people that are told you have outdoor allergens, they don't really have outdoor allergens. They have an overwhelmed immune system, and so they're reacting to lots of things in the environment. But if they just dial that food in and learn what to dial in, they can get that and pull it under control. Is this true? We are not meant to eat grasses because we do not have 4 stomachs like a cow. It's not ideal. No, humans are, I mean, look, we can eat a lot of different things. Our gut is designed to break down the nutrients from food that we put in our mouth. And if our gut's really strong and healthy, yes, we can. Now, that being said, 40% of the population, as far as we know, is allergic to grasses. So if you're thinking about things like wild rice, or if you're thinking about, you know, other types of grasses to consume, and a lot of people do these green drinks where they're doing the barley and the rye and the oat grasses, I don't recommend those things. They're, you know, again, 40% of the population is allergic to grasses, so drinking them in a green juice every day doesn't, in my opinion, doesn't serve you. I talked about this in an email I sent out on Thursday or Friday earlier this week, where I was actually talking about we have a grass drink that is, it's not a grass drink, I'm sorry, it's a green drink that we make out of all organic fruit and vegetables with no grasses in it. So my advice is, if you're going to gravitate toward a drink-based product, it's a green drink. Use Ultra Food VF, and because there's no grass in it whatsoever. But no, I don't recommend consuming grass at any degree as a staple food, because you don't have the digestive tract to handle that on a regular basis. Let's see here. Guar Gum. Mary Ann is asking about Guar Gum. Guar Gum is actually a lot safer and very well tolerated. So if you're seeing that on one of your food products, then that's one that, again, it's a little bit more well tolerated. Now, some people have trouble with any gums, but if you're not one of them, again, that's one that's more tolerated. And I think if we can find the link for you, we can put it up in the feed on gums. We have it's a post I have on Gluten Free Society. It's a very thorough one on the toxic food additives and listing of all the different gums that you can read more about. Okay, let's see here. What about ground up seeds? A little bit easier to get access to, because when you grind them up and you break out that outer shell, you're giving your gut and the digestive enzymes and the acid access to the insides of that, so you're able to get to those nutrients. But it still has the anti-nutritive properties, and the seeds still have the sensory proteins in them. So again, in my opinion, it becomes an issue of consumption, and so how often you're consuming them and the quantity. And that's where it can create a problem. So again, I don't recommend seeds as a staple food in your diet, where you're using them every day as something that you're eating to get a lot of your calories from it. Does soaking seeds make them easier to digest? Yes, it can. Soak, drain, soak, drain. We mentioned that here a minute ago, and that includes, I mentioned it with the beans, but you can do the same thing with seeds. What type of alcohol is acceptable? Look, I don't recommend alcohol. Alcohol is not acceptable if you're trying to heal. Now, if you are in good health and you want to have an occasional drink, there are a number of different types of alcohol that are grain-free. So if we're talking about gluten sensitivity, you know, there are a number of different kinds. The problem with many of the alcohols is they're poisonous because of the pesticide that is found in a lot of the alcohols. So for example, a lot of your wines contain glyphosate. A lot of even your hard liquors, you know, for example, rum is gluten-free. It's sugar cane. It's distilled down sugar cane. But sugar cane, if they're not using an organic sugar cane, then that sugar cane it's a genetically modified crop. It's being sprayed with glyphosate. So how much of that actually ends up in the alcohol? So I don't recommend using a lot of the alcoholic beverages unless you're finding them in an organic fashion. And then when you do find them in an organic fashion, don't use them liberally, use them very modestly, because, you know, alcohol is it's a slow liver poison, and again, you know, too much can become a problem. Now again, if you're using it in moderation, I don't think there's a major issue with that if your health is good. But if you've got liver damage or you're trying to recover from years of chronic illness, alcohol should be completely out of your diet. Let's see here. So this question about, you know, do I have anything about macular amyloidosis? Look, amyloidosis is autoimmune disease. You don't need to have specific information about macular amyloidosis. You need to have specific information about what are the triggers for autoimmune disease. Now, I'm going to put up a link here. I want you guys, if you're listening, and maybe this is all new to you, and this is somewhat, when it's new to you, it might be somewhat paralyzing in the sense that it can be overwhelming, right? But I want to invite you to the Autoimmune Revolution. And this is you guys are hearing this for the first time. 2 years ago, we launched what was called the Autoimmune Revolution. It was a summit, the Autoimmune Revolution Summit, Breaking the Cycle of Pain. Well, this year, and as a matter of fact, on November 5th, we're going Autoimmune Revolution Part 2, right? We call AIR for short, Autoimmune Revolution. So autoimmunerevolution.org, make sure you sign up for the Autoimmune Revolution. I've interviewed more than 30 leading experts on the topic of autoimmune disease, including, you know, what you can do, what kind of lifestyle changes that you need to consider, what are some of the lab tests that you want to have run, what are some of the things that you need your doctors to rule out to help you find true answers. These are the types of questions that we're answering. And this year, at the end of the Autoimmune Revolution, I'm doing something very, very special. I've taken the entire series of lectures and I've condensed them down into a very, very concise 2-hour presentation that is a very step-by-step, here's what you need to do, here's what you need to look for. So if you are not aware of that, go autoimmunerevolution.org and just sign up. It's free, it doesn't cost you anything. Just go sign up and you'll get you'll start getting those emails as we come around to the summit. Again, it won't go live until November 5th. Okay. So again, questions keep coming in. What about raw pumpkin seeds? Yeah, they're okay to eat, but again, not a staple food. And not if you're struggling with gut dysfunction. Remember, this is not an all or none. This is not me saying you could never have these things. This is me saying use good diligence and judgment on how your gut feels and how you're doing to be able to make some of these decisions. Okay, unless you're getting specific testing, where if you're getting specific gut testing and specific food testing, it's another matter. We can dial it in a lot tighter. So like if you came to see me, I wouldn't be guessing about really much of this at all. I would be doing very specific types of tests to discern what it is that you needed to eat or not eat, and I wouldn't be you know, just guessing at it. But I'm trying to give you categorically what are some of the major problems that I see consistently within the clinic with people. I do not recommend hair testing for nutritional status. So Tiffany, I think that was your question. Hair testing is not going to give you much on your actual nutritional status. Hair is an excretion material, and so what you're seeing come out in the hair is not necessarily an indicator for what your body is lacking. It could be an indicator for what your body had too much of. Hair can be very, very misleading as a biochemical element to measure. Now, that being said, hair can be somewhat helpful in other ways, but I don't recommend it as a standalone to look at your nutritional status. What are my thoughts on muscle spasm and gluten? Stephanie's asking that question. Very simple. Gluten can cause muscle spasm. Gluten can cause a lot of different symptoms, and muscle spasm is one of them. So if you're struggling with chronic muscle spasm, you're still eating gluten, and you're not sure whether the gluten is causing it, the best thing you can do is get genetically tested to see whether going gluten-free is the right diet for you to follow. You know, barring that, if you don't want to, you know, expend the money to get the testing done, you can always go on a true gluten-free diet, and that doesn't cost you anything. It just costs you time and effort in terms of cooking and learning. And if your muscle spasm goes away, you kind of have a solid answer there. Okay. It looks like, let's see, is white rice safe or should I just settle for brown rice? Okay, I'm going to let the audience answer that. So those of you who are in the audience who have read No Grain, No Pain, why don't you chime in and answer, I'm going to mangle your name and I apologize if I do, why Jiro Naju, if you guys want to answer him for me, because that's something that I'm hoping that you guys already know the answer to. Okay. So Sophia says, I've gone wheat and dairy free for skin macular amyloidosis and still eating spelt flour. Got to get the spelt flour out, Sophia. That's not doing you any favors. Shannon, do my products ship to Canada? Yes, we do ship to Canada. So, and that includes genetic testing. We do genetic testing all over the world. So it doesn't matter where in the world that you're at, you can still get genetic testing done if you want that. I've heard, Lisa's asking, I've heard some foods that can contain mold, like coffee. Can this hurt someone who's trying to heal from dysfunctional digestive system? It can. It absolutely can. Mold can be a major problem, and I've seen people be allergic to mold. I've seen people be allergic to the toxins that molds produce, like mycotoxins, and there are a number of different forms of mycotoxins. So mold can play a role for many in restricting their capacity for recovery. It's one of the reasons why we check for mold allergy. It's another one of the reasons why I like to check for mycotoxin levels. Mold toxin levels, if they're too high in the system, then we know it's spelling a problem for an individual. All right, lots of you are answering the rice question. Thank you for chiming in, folks, on that. Okay, let's do, I love this question because it comes up a lot. Is magnesium stearate okay? Yes, it's okay. There's some articles on the internet that really talk very poorly about magnesium stearate. And magnesium stearate is perfectly safe. It does not create a biofilm in the gut. It does not bog down the gut. It's actually, for those of you who aren't familiar with supplemental manufacturing, when you're trying to produce different supplements, when you're mixing powder, it's not the same thing as mixing liquids. When you mix liquids, you stir them and they typically blend together very nicely. But this doesn't occur as well with powder. So when you're mixing in powder, oftentimes you have to use what's called a flow agent. It basically helps the powders mix together so that you get, in this capsule you get 100 milligrams and in this capsule you get 100 milligrams. Otherwise, if you're mixing powders with different densities, what ends up happening is this capsule gets 10 milligrams, this one gets 90, etc., etc., etc. You don't end up with an even mix. So sometimes there are flow agents that are used, and there's some flow agents that are good and there's some flow agents that are not so good. Some companies use, for example, rice flour as a flow agent. In my opinion, it's a very poor flow agent because a lot of the rice is contaminated with arsenic, cadmium, beside the fact that it can contain a form of rice gluten that is known to create an intestinal inflammation. So bad in the case if you're gluten sensitive, it's a very poor choice of filler. Even if you're not gluten sensitive, it's a poor choice of filler because of the heavy metal issues that surround rice. Whereas magnesium stearate has none of those issues. Very safe. Even if you have 6 different supplements that all have magnesium stearate, it's still very safe to use. No side effects in the way of that. So I hope that answers your question. Another very common filler that's used sometimes is silicate, which is basically silicone or silic. It's a element found naturally in the Earth's crust. Again, it can be used as a flow agent because it's a non-toxic inert flow agent. So it doesn't add anything to a product, but it's just used to make sure that it mixes well so that, again, each capsule that you take has, consistent dose. So good question. I'm glad somebody asked it because I've been meaning to address that question for a while. Is there any starch that is safe? Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of starches that is safe. It just depends on who the person is, though. I mean, again, one man or woman's food is another man or woman's poison. And so it really boils down to that. Starch is not bad for you. Carbohydrates are not bad for you. As popular as the ketogenic diet is right now, it's a trend and a fad. Not everybody should be on the ketogenic diet. It's not God's diet that's going to save everybody from every disease ever. It's being highly popularized right now. And there are some people where it's very effective to do certain things. But we don't necessarily want to just say everybody in the world needs to be on a no-carb diet. We've made that mistake. Look, low-fat diets, low-fat, no-fat diets, low-protein diets. How many times are we going to repeat history and make those same mistakes? It's not about cutting a particular macronutrient out. It's not about cutting out carbs, fats, or proteins. It's about balance. It's about having a good balance. I like the rule of thirds. Meaning that when you're looking at your plate, a third carbohydrate, a third protein, and a third fat. That's equal. It's equality. That's balance between your macros on your plate. So as opposed to just saying all carbohydrates are bad, look, the reason why carbohydrates are bad today is because we just went through 30 years where every food, every processed food item, they were adding carbohydrates because they were taking the fat out of it, so they had to add something to make it taste good. So what did they add? They added carbohydrate sugar. And so now we've got 30 years of carbohydrate toxicity, so everybody's now running in the opposite direction. Well, it's not the exact correct run. Yes, people have to pull back on the carbohydrates, but it doesn't mean no carbohydrates. So let's be very clear that carbs are not bad. excessive carbs are bad. Okay. Well, I got more questions, but I got no time. So, folks, this has been a great evening. Thanks for spending it with me. Again, if you're new to the Dr. Osborne Show, the Pick Dr. Osborne's Brain occurs every Monday night at 6 p.m. Central Standard Time. So tune back in next Monday. If you want reminders, go over to glutenfreesociety.org. Make sure that you sign up for our free newsletter. We'll also send you a gluten-free survival kit. So make sure if you don't have that, if you haven't picked that up already, go and pick that up. Also, make sure you click on the gear or the subscribe button, either above me or below me, and make sure that you're subscribing to our feed if you want to get notifications of when we're going live. Sometimes we do impromptu lives where we just go live in the middle of the day, and if you're there and if you get a notification, you get access to that information. So make sure you subscribe. You can also go over to youtube.com/glutenology. You can subscribe to us at Facebook at Dr. Peter Osborne. And you can subscribe to us on Instagram at Dr. Osborne. So we'll see you next week. Have a fantastic rest of your week. This is Dr. Osborne with the Pick Dr. Osborne's Brain Show signing out.